For more than a decade, Gary Golden has been providing insights to industry leaders on issues shaping society and business. As an academically trained futurist, he helps clients bring structure and discipline to exploring implications of long-term change. Excuse me. He has worked with a wide range of clients from transportation to PepsiCo to Disney. I would be fascinated to hear what he told the big mouse, but maybe another time. I first heard Gary at a state library conference about 5 years ago. I'd never heard of futurist, but was really looking forward to it. Among the many concepts he brought up was the idea of environmental scanning as a tool to look at the future, which I've used ever since, both in personal and professional situations. He also predicted at least two things that clearly came to pass in my world. Unfortunately, we'll call it due to age, I cannot remember the specifics, but one had to do with my profession and one was environmental. And when I realized that they had happened, I remember thinking, Gary called it. Go ahead, Gary, it's all yours.
All right, the things I get right mask everything that I always get wrong, right? So thank you for the invitation to join you all today. Happy Friday. How many people are from Philadelphia on this call? Maybe a wave. If not, I grew up in Philadelphia and I say water. This is water. So that'll be my, everyone's like, what did he say? So first, thank you for the introduction, and I want to just start by sharing the new chapter in my life. So I, am largely a corporate futurist, right? I do workshops and keynotes and leadership seminars, and I will continue to do that. But COVID has kind of muted that part of my practice. Just before COVID kind of arrived in our world, I signed a lease in this beautiful 700 square foot space, which you can see right there, at the bottom of our street here in Brooklyn. And the next chapter is going to be opening up a business called Into the Future, where I'm going to be teaching teenagers about how the world's changing and how their generation can influence that future. So it's kind of an after-school learning enrichment business. And we are hoping, fingers crossed, that we can open up in late September with small classes of 10. And we're going to run 4 classes, the future of TikTok, which is kind of the new creator platform.
Oops. Oh, we lost sound. You're muted. Hang on.
Oh, sorry. I was in the big mute. So future of TikTok, and then a class on the future of creative professions. So for teenagers that want to be writers or artists or designers, then a class on the future of computer vision, which will look at, what happens when cars and phones can look at the world and understand what they're seeing, and then an entrepreneurial club. So you all are organized around a transition, and I am in a transition as well. So hopefully the next time we meet, I can have some positive stories of our success and try to receive COVID as a great gift, and that young people are going to want to talk about the future. That's hopefully the blessing in all of this. So I wanted to just set up the experience here. I know we're recording it, but also know that I will be sending through Jenny the PDF of this presentation, as well as a link to the SurveyMonkey. So thank you to everybody that was able to respond to it. We will keep that SurveyMonkey open if people want to go in after this session, and I'll just provide kind of a summary of all the responses, which have no named attribution. So it's all anonymous, but you'll be able to see the group's thinking on what is changing ahead. So for today, I want to do a few things. I want to just introduce this idea of what it means to think like a futurist. I'm going to be walking right up to the line of being academic, and that I do find it useful to introduce frameworks and to give a little structure to this idea of thinking about the future. And then I want to look into some drivers of change around demographics and technology, and then we'll build in some time at the end for a discussion. So having said that, we will pause at different points and give you a chance to ask questions or provide any builds. So with that, foresight really is the study of social change, right? When people say, "Oh, you're a futurist," at the end of the day, it's really my job is to understand how the world changes. So when we think about this notion of change, there are three lenses that we can apply. The first is hindsight, right, where we look back at the world and capture all the wisdom and the experience of ourselves and those around us, and we try to apply that hindsight into assessing what's happening in the world and what could happen. Right? It's very useful, and it's probably the lens of change that we all draw upon the most. Then there's insight, which is this notion of having a little bit more nuance on implications of changes that are happening today, right? So it's a kind of a present day focus. And then foresight is this idea of being able to anticipate and lead change, right? So if someone says to you, like, what is foresight, this field that futurists practice within, it's this idea of having the capacity to anticipate and lead change. So all three of these lenses are valid. All three are useful. But for the sake of today and the center of my world, I want us to really try to embrace this idea of foresight. So if we needed to break down what a futurist does with organizations, you can think of three primary activities. The first is investigation, right? Wynn had mentioned this idea of scanning, horizon scanning, environmental scanning. Futurists are paying attention to now and understanding what is going on across a broad range of topics. Then we want to be able to turn those signals into stories and explore the implications. Now, when we think about the future, we can do this in two ways. One is by forecasting, and that is simply the extrapolation of trends that are going in a particular direction at a particular rate, and we just kind of go up or down, right? And most organizations that you all have been involved with have probably used forecasting as the dominant mode of imagining the future. Where futurists try to bring more value is this idea of scenario thinking, and a scenario is simply a story about the future that's different than today, right? It is not a low, medium, or high variation of the forecast, right? It's based off of a completely different set of assumptions. And then the final thing that futurists want to do is inspire people within the organization or the society to move forward, and usually in a different direction, right? So communicating that need for change is kind of the most important and the final activity of a futurist. So that's what we do with organizations in various capacities. And then kind of the final little mini framework here is that there are different mechanisms of change. The first mechanism of change is going to be defined as a trend. And when you think of a trend, you need to use the language of more or less, right? More people using mobile phones, more CO2 in the atmosphere, more people over the age of 65, right? It is a source of continuity. And because it's a source of continuity, we can apply forecasting and give us what we call the most plausible future. Now, in the short term, it is that trend that's most likely to shape the future, right? That's the thing that we can really expect will influence tomorrow. But there are two other mechanisms of change that happen that are sources of discontinuities. They are breaks from that trend. And the second bucket is an event. And an event can be something that's scheduled, like a presidential election or a end of a term of a leadership within an organization. It can be a wild card event, which is a low probability, high impact event. We're living in that world right now, right? Events have changed our world, right? COVID was an event that changed the world. Now, you can't forecast events. So we need to think in terms of possible futures through scenarios. And then the final mechanism of change is what we call choices. And that refers to our preferred future, the aspirational future. So it could be, you know, the formation of the European Union, the coming together of two different organizations, a personal decision to leave an organization or leave a relationship, right? Those are our choices that drive the future. So when futurists are talking about change, we want to get specific. We want to understand, is it trends, events, or choices that we're really trying to focus on? So I'm going to speak for another 5 minutes and then we'll take a break here. But the final concept here to kind of give you a sense of how futurists try to break down the world is based off of this notion of era-based change. So when we think about change in the world, we can think about it in two ways. One is incremental change within an era. And an era for us is a period of time where, you know, the social norms, the rules of the game, the conditions of the world remain the same, right? They may be speeding up, slowing down, but it's still the same conditions. Most of us can handle incremental change. You usually don't need a futurist to come in to talk to you about incremental change. So what futurists really specialize in is the transition, right? And the transition is shaped by what we call transformational change across a new era. So I want to break down this idea of an era into stages. So we all understand, you know, how things happen, because they don't just come out of nowhere, right? So in this world of an era-based analysis, we often hear this phrase, an S-curve era, an S-curve era. So what you see on the screen here is this elongated S, right? So what you see is if you go up the x-axis, it's basically kind of performance and adoption of the system. If you go across the bottom, it's time. So at the beginning, the first stage of an S-curve era is what we would characterize as slow change, slow emerging change. So you can think, let's just think of like computing devices, like a personal computer. In the 1970s and 80s, it was like, you know, computers were number crunching devices and there were a few of them in the world. And if someone said to you, hey, do you want a computer at home? You'd be like, why do I want a calculating device in my house, right? And the natural tendency for us as individuals is to underestimate that change. Like, those computer devices have no use for me. Then we enter a period of what we would refer to as rapid change, where that system and the adoption of that system starts to improve and accelerate in its impact in the world. And at that point, we tend to overestimate the impact of that change. So we can think of the 1990s when, you know, it was Dell Computer and Gateway and everyone was buying a computer, and we had the dot-com bubble, right? So human beings go from underestimating change to overestimating change in a single step. And then the final stage is what we would call the plateau, where it's like everyone's got a computer, and you get a new computer, you don't tell people at the office because you've got 5 computers at home. And the ability for the organization or the society to kind of innovate and gain benefit from that system is maxed out. You can't squeeze any more juice out of that thing, right? So the job of the futurist is to understand, where are we on this era base of change? So I'm not going to get into the weeds here, but I want to give you a kind of I want to look at 3 broad categories of our society just to illustrate this notion of era-based change, and then we'll pause and talk. So if you think about mobility, right, the ability, you know, to walk on the plains of the savannas of Africa to the moon, we went through different eras of change, right? Just human animal muscle to boat to rail to automobile to flight. And then the job of the future is to say, hey, what's next? Is it a change within the existing era of the automobile, or is it a new era of mobility? And when we start to look at and assess this notion of era-based change, we come up with a couple lessons. And the first lesson is that the old legacy eras don't go away, right? And I know the great, the example that jumps into most people's minds is the mixtape, right? The cassette tape, like that certainly went away. But for the most part, legacy systems, they just continue on. They're not the dynamic source of change, but they don't go away. So the future is not subtractive. The future is additive, right? And it takes a lot of effort to really think about the future being additive rather than subtractive, because I think most people think once something new is introduced, the old thing goes away, right? And then the second lesson here is that the new thing that comes out often underperforms the previous system, right? So when the automobile came out, the railroad people were like, yeah, good luck to you. Like, we control the rail networks. We're based in cities. Your automobile can't help us, right? So that's the notion of error-based change for mobility. And then the job of the futurist is to understand, where are we? And we determine where we are in that slow or rapid change by looking at signals of change, right? We're looking at who is doing what and how well are they doing it. And when we start to see enough signals, we say, hey, we're about to enter that fast period of change. So that's transportation. And then, the other big one, the second one here is material science. I mean, we're here because of our ability to manipulate silicon on a chip. And, the modern world is based off of polymers and plastics, right? And society has gone through different eras of materials engineering. So the job of the future is to understand what's next. And then I'm not going to go into the details here. What I do with clients is I get into the weeds. I really help them start to pick apart, what does this ability to print a house or to print a car or to print a metal replacement part for your tractor mean for your local economy and the supply chain? So understanding that era transition is just the first piece, and then what futurists do is really help clients assess the details. And then the final era transition to highlight is probably the one that's had the biggest impact in our world, which is media and communication. So I think, most of us, we recognize that for the majority of human existence, it was just one-to-one communication. You only got information from the person that was right in front of you. And they may have had a pamphlet with fake news. They may have had a pamphlet that was, a lie, but it was a one-to-one communication. And then we entered the broadcast era of radio, of large print, of television, and it was very disruptive, right? And then 15 years ago, we entered the world of not one to many, but many to many, and social media. So then futurists are trying to figure out what's next, what's next. And the one idea that is really rising up to the top is this notion that more and more people in the world, let's say 3 to 10 years from now, will have what we could think of as a digital assistant. So I will have like an IBM Watson, a voice assistant that helps me. And when I am receiving information from an organization, they are not targeting me as a person, they're targeting my assistant. And then the assistant will give me that information when it's relevant, when I need it. So that is the idea of era-based change. And if you look around the world today, you look at healthcare, you look at farming and agriculture, you look at retail, education, all of these major industries are going through what we would refer to as era-based transitions. So I am going to just pause. I do have more to share if we're willing to go forward, but I'm going to pause here and just see if folks have any questions or challenges or thoughts on how futurists think about trends, events, and choices, and kind of this idea of understanding transformational eras of change.
So Gary, I have one question.
Please.
How does human behavior get factored into some of the forecasting scenarios?
So that's the human behavior is you use that in the weeds conversation. Like, okay, we know we're shifting from a broadcast era into social media. And in a broadcast media era, one entity controls the message to other people. I have truth, I've got a lie, it's me giving it to them. They have no power. You move into a social media era, and many people are controlling the information that is created, remixed, repurposed, and shared to many other people. You, as an organization, have very little control. That is a human behavioral conversation that is in this social media era. And that's where you would apply it. The human behavior doesn't always define your assessment of what's the thing we're going into. It's the, well, what are going to be the new challenges, right? And another good one with human behavior is in healthcare, right? So healthcare is moving from what we would refer to as where the system gets paid by activity. So you get a bad knee, you go in, you get the knee fixed, and then you go out, and 6 months later, knee's not working, you go back in, they get paid twice, versus getting paid for what is referred to as the outcome. It's a value-based or an outcome-based model. And that is an era-based transition for the healthcare industry. And there's a lot of responsibility on the human side of that equation. Like, you know, did you throw out your knee doing something you shouldn't have been doing? So human behavior is big. It's just secondary in the conversation.
If anyone else has a question, you know, you can stick your hand up and then we can call on you and unmute. Any other questions at this point? Virginia. Unmute.
Oh, Virginia, I think you're unmuted, but the sound isn't coming through.
Oh, wait a minute. Let me see if I can do anything here. Hang
Okay.
on. Yeah, you are unmuted, so I'm not sure why I'm not hearing you. Say something. I can't hear you.
Yeah, that might be a system thing on the...
You could send us in chat.
Sorry.
Anyone else while we're...
Just a,
Sally.
Hi, just a quick question. Gary, where did you say you're located?
In Brooklyn, New York.
In
Yeah,
Brooklyn.
I grew up in Philadelphia,
Ah,
lived in Wisconsin. I lived in India and Nepal for 2 years. And
Hey.
then the most strange place I ever lived, I went to Texas for 6 years.
Ooh, we can ask you anything.
And then I followed a girl to, I lived in Boston for a year, where I followed my now wife, and
Ah.
we've been in Brooklyn for 12 years.
Excellent. A good place.
Yeah, yeah.
So Gary, Virginia's question is, can you give an example of when you got it right and when you got it
Oh,
wrong?
Virginia. So, well, one on the right, and when I don't know that this is one of the things that I had talked about in that I did a lot of work with libraries for a period of time, and one of the things that we had talked about was there was this early stage where mental, and I'm going to talk about mental health here shortly, mindfulness as a practice, teaching young people kind of, you know, emotional and kind of mental health intelligence was on the fringes of society. And I was like to the libraries, like, you've got, this is your thing. They're going to be coming to you for these mindfulness classes. And, you know, I'm sure there were a few librarians that were like, yeah, and most of them were like, get out of here. And then a couple years later, I came back. I think it may have even been the Massachusetts group. And the one woman stood up and said, you were right. We have mindfulness classes like 5 days a week. So like that was one that I felt like I got the tipping point. And then one that is, I'm going to be right, but I was wrong on the timing, was in energy, there is, when you say electric vehicle, right? When you say the electric vehicles, the electric refers to the motor, not a battery. So really the electric car is an electric motor, not a piston motor, but an electric, like a fan, your ceiling fan is an electric motor, right? And I believe that hydrogen electric cars are the future for cost and scaling, but battery electric was first out of the gate.
Mm.
And those people still think that it's going to be the winner. I think they're wrong, but I was sort of wrong on it, and I'm hoping I'm going to be right. Yeah, usually futurists are not always like wrong in a that didn't happen, the era transition didn't happen. The timing
Mm.
takes longer.
Mm.
So
Awesome.
thanks, Virginia.
Anybody else before we move on? I think we're good, Gary, if you want to.
Okay, so so I'm conscious of time, you know, and if it's not coming across already, like I like to give a lot in terms of information. So I don't want to overwhelm us, but I like to share. So let's jump in. So when we you know, when we think about the future and talk about the future, you know, I've been doing this now for, yeah, I mean, close to 15 years. There is a tendency, right, where what we need to talk about when we think about the future are the like very human, societal level, foundational stuff. Like, why are people happy or not happy? Why do people feel a sense of purpose or not? And how do we address, you know, historical injustices? And how do we, you know, deal with this globalization but still be local, right? Those are the things that we have to talk about. But most people, when they think about the future, want to talk about technology and globalization and the empowered self and growth, right? And all of these things are influencing the future in enormous ways. And I love them. I love talking about this stuff. But I want to recognize that, you know, the stuff on that left side matters much more in the end. It's just harder to talk about them because of the dynamic of change within those topics is more social and cultural, and it takes more time and it's more amorphous, right? It's difficult. So one of the things that futurists try to do is create buckets of change or themes of change. So we're not just, you know, biased in talking about all social things or all technology or all politics, right? We use this idea of steep categories of change, which I'll just walk through one and highlight some themes in each. The steep buckets of change keep us honest, right? It's like, okay, if I'm going to talk about the future of healthcare, I need to think about healthcare from social, technological, economic, environmental, and political, right? So steep just keeps us honest. So let's jump into the social change, which is largely about demographics and culture. So what we see in front of us is a population pyramid, and the set itself is called the demographic transition model, a couple other names, but it's basically a way of understanding your population of a city, a state, a country, a region based off of age. So at the bottom of the chart there, you're going to see age. And then in this case, we're just using traditional male, female gender, right? So you just plot everyone in your society across those two factors, and you get what you see as this population pyramid. Now, there is a phrase in economics that demographics is destiny, and that phrase has some truth. It's a bit overstated, but it's got some truth. And the reason is that if you want to understand the future of your society and, you know, how many roads you're going to need, how many schools you're going to need, what type of medical system will you need, you need to understand the demographics. Now, the majority of human existence was, demographically speaking, based in what you see as stage one, right? This is like, you know, we're like roaming around in small bands in early agricultural civilization. Women were basically pregnant the majority of their life. You know, most of those children didn't live past age 5. It was a harsh existence, right? And there were very few older people in that society, right? And that was the majority of human existence, right? And then we moved into stage 2 and we started to form cities and craft culture, and more people, you know, lived longer. And then the modern world, the 20th century, gave us what we would see in stage 3, which is the healthiest population pyramid, which is largely urban metro, smaller families, women, you know, in control of their kind of reproductive health. They're in the workforce, and you finally get an older population in this society, right? And then the 4th stage is contracting, where you have a society that the families are so small that you're not really replacing that population, right? So if we look at the United States, the story of the past, you know, 15, 20 years and the next 20 years is based off of our demographic destiny. So the bubble that you see on the left side here is the baby boomer generation. And this is what we would refer to in economics as the demographic dividend. This is the period of time where you have lots of people. The baby boomers had kids, they had jobs, they were making the most money in their life, and they were spending it. And we saw the emergence of, like, you know, the SUV, big box retail. It was an economic boom. And now that demographic dividend is waning, right? The kids are out of the house, or they're in the basement maybe, but largely that demographic dividend of the baby boomer generation has waned. It's gone away. And I believe that the most important demographic story of the next 20 to 30 years is how we respond to the aging of the baby boomer population, right? So in the United States, there are 2 different stories of our demographic destiny. If you are in a metro region, like not like downtown Boston, but the whole metro economy, you mostly have a healthy population pyramid with families and kids and workers. If you live in a small or rural town, you have an inverted pyramid, which is not good. You can't get the families to move back to the town. You have an older population that is increasingly requiring money and services rather than generating it. And if I were to just kind of get negative thinking about the future, it is this rural versus metro tension that's driving all of the political polarization in our society, right? And it's demographics. So what I think is going to happen over the next 10 years is we're going to see a reframing of the caregiver. The archetype of the caregiver is arguably the most universal archetype in the world, right? At some point in almost everybody's life, they are a caregiver. They're caring for children or their parents or a friend or family member that's dealing with substance abuse or has had an event. And we have, it's kind of like the early childhood people back in, you know, the 70s and 80s. It wasn't a professionalized archetype and career, right? You just had a basement or a house and you opened up a childcare facility. When you become a caregiver, and then it became professionalized, right? When you become a caregiver, you just get pushed into it for most people. You have no idea what to do. And I think that we're going to start to see a lot of organizations and communities try to reframe what a caregiver does and how they do it. So we're starting to see companies deal with the biggest issues, and finance is the, you know, like you're the caregiver of your mother or your child, whatever it is, like try going to the bank and getting money out of their account, right? There are lots of issues. There are people that use different payment solutions where you have an individual that might have substance abuse, they're in recovery, and they get a, you know, you give them, you're controlling their money, and they can only use that debit card in certain stores to avoid, you know, going back. And then there are, you know, companies now starting to help with end of life planning and making that process, you know, more positive, and dealing with social isolation. Silver Nest is kind of like an Airbnb roommate type platform for seniors that are looking for companions in a home, right? So I think that caregiving, the caregiver, is one of the big conversations that we're likely to see. So I think I'm just going to do one more here and then we'll pause. Mental health, mental wellness it's been something that I have been following now for close to 10 years. And I think most people on this call will agree. In the past 2 years, if you've been paying attention and really kind of like watching the signals here, we in this American society have completely reframed mental health. Like, you used to put that stuff under the rug, like, don't talk about it, don't say it, just take your medicine. And now it's like every celebrity is like, I am rich and I'm dealing with anxiety. Like, it is completely reframed in our society. And I think that is about to accelerate. And I think that acceleration is going to come from the millennials and Gen Z. So I think that this electorate, this combination of generations is going to make mental wellness a subject that can be talked about and can be addressed in various ways. And if you look at young people today, they have this amazing ability to form communities, right? And these movements, these communities are forming around mental health. So there is a meme, a community, loosely speaking, called Project Semicolon. And it's basically, it deals with people that would take their own life, and it says like, your life isn't done. It's a semicolon. It's not a period. So you have young people putting this semicolon as a tattoo on their bodies as this expression of like, it's not over. It's not a period. It's a semicolon. Like, it continues. And that's just such a far cry. I mean, I'm 45 years old. That's such a far cry from anything that I ever experienced as a young person in talking about mental health. And if you look at the celebrities and the athletes, they're all coming out in the open. It's no longer embarrassing or shameful to admit that you're dealing with mental health issues. And we have industries like the food industry, the restaurant industry, which is notoriously toxic, starting to form different organizations and campaigns. You can look these up later, that basically try to shine the light and to bring help to people that are in the restaurant and food industry and dealing with mental health. So one of the issues that this generation will have to decide is this intersection of technology and mental health. Your phone can determine if you are happy or sad or slipping into a negative state. It can look at your texts and see that you're being shorter or saying certain words. It can look at your face. There's a number of different algorithms that can detect mood and emotional state changes. So this is not, there's no debating this, right? The question is, should we? And there's movies and episodes that look at a future where it's like, you have to check in and give your mental health check-in before you go on the clock. And I think there's a serious conversation about, should we use technology to detect people's shift in emotional and mental states? And the reasons for it would be to intervene. And the reason, and many other, I'm sure, but then the reason against it is it's their life and privacy, right? So that is, it's demographics, right? But it's really the social stuff. So I want to just give me 3 more minutes and we'll just break for a conversation here. Technology obviously is a huge driver. AI, this ability for software to learn on its own, natural language processing, computer vision, there's a whole host of information technologies. The life sciences is changing. There's autonomous systems. Like, this field is huge. We're not going to get into it, but I think we all know intuitively that it's changing. The globalization story is going into a new chapter. We don't know how it's going to play out, but largely the way that futurists have framed it and economists have framed it is, there were decades of what we would refer to as West to West economic globalization, Europe and the United States, North America. Then it was West to East, brought in Japan, Korea, Thailand, Taiwan, and then China. And the model, the mode, the flow of economic globalization for the future could be what we refer to as south to south, where it is Nigeria trading with Brazil. It is, you know, the UAE trading with Mexico. It is a south to south chapter of globalization. Now, how this plays out, or if globalization becomes more inward and regional, we don't know. So the last thing I would want to talk about here is who do we think are the big players in the economy moving forward? And if I kind of just want to plant a seed here with this group, just, you know, just for your own kind of sake of how you're seeing the world, increasingly it is companies that are tech supply chain companies. The ability to move objects and products around the world really seems to be the thing that's going to drive the economy. And the risk here coming out of COVID is that small businesses are not able to play in this space, right? And the big companies and the big brands of the future are likely to be excellent at supply chains. So one of the ways that we may counter that is through a localization of the economy. There's this idea of micro fulfillment centers, so not having big Amazon distribution hubs, but something, you take your local grocery store and they would cut that store in half. It would be a smaller retail space, but in the back end, they have a fulfillment center and they're able to keep that local economy going. So the micro fulfillment center is big. And for me, it comes down to how creative can we get in supporting local economies. So there's a company called Reef, which was for many years just a parking management company. And they kind of got the tech fever, and they now see themselves as a tech community ecosystem company. And what they are doing is providing infrastructure for restaurants that can't afford to have retail spaces, and they use what are referred to as ghost kitchens. So you have a ghost kitchen, which basically sits somewhere, you don't even see it, and it can make Italian food, you know, Indian food, and Mexican food in the same kitchen. And then this company, the Reef company, is basically saying, bring people to the parking spaces, bring people to the parking lots, bring people to the parks, and we will create the ecosystem for businesses to thrive in this world. So I'm just going to pause there. There's a lot more that I can talk about, but I want to be respectful of time. Maybe have people kind of breathe in, or maybe give me even a fake smile, like that was pleasant. And see if there are any questions.
I do have questions for you. One question is, how does one study formally in preparation for becoming a futurist?
So there is no credentialing system to become a futurist, right? So if anyone on this call wants to call themselves a futurist, you could say that. But there are programs in the United States and abroad in what we would call future studies or strategic foresight. And in the United States, those two programs are at the University of Houston and the University of Hawaii. And you can judge me, I went to Houston. So the University of Houston Future Studies program has been around since the early 1970s. It's rooted in sociology, the study of social change. And I went to that program 2003 to 2005. So I did a graduate degree in future studies.
So this question, I think, is related. How do you keep up with all these trends, and what do you read and watch?
So this is always a big question, right? So the thing that I do is I find very smart, passionate people that curate information. And then I follow them on Twitter largely, or I follow them through other means. But let's say that Linda is an expert in the future of education, and Elaine is on the future of healthcare, right? And they're not just experts, they like to share, like, watch this video, read this article, follow this person, read this book. I follow Linda and Elaine. I let them do all the heavy lifting. And then when I find those signals, like this video, this article, I tag it. I save it as a bookmark in this, it's a platform called Digo. And then I tag it like food, education, healthcare. And then at the end of the day, I have tagged probably 50 stories on various topics. And then I just simply go back to those signals when I need to.
How big an influence is COVID going to have?
Oh my gosh.
Okay,
I'm gonna start crying or something. I think the consensus seems to be that really in the middle consensus that COVID has simply accelerated trends and directions of change that existed prior to COVID. It's been an accelerant. I think that there is going to be, and COVID was an event. We can't forget that it was an event. I think there's going to be, we're going to get through it. We're going to get through it. And then I think there's going to be a snapback, like some of the old ways of doing it's going to get back because we have to. And then I think over the next 10 years, we are going to see a step change in things like education and healthcare and transportation, et cetera. So I think that COVID is going to accelerate those pre-existing trends, snap back, and we're all going to agree that, yeah, that didn't work. And then COVID's impact is 10 years out. It's not 2023. It's 2030 when you're going to feel it.
Someone wants to know what stocks you feel.
So the bad thing about being a future, well, there's certainly things that I'm like, oh, I wish I had money to buy that. The problem with stock picking is that when I am looking at a signal of change, like it is such a small, materially speaking, it is such a small piece of that large company's bottom line that it doesn't move the stock. Now, you could look at something like Shopify or, like e-commerce, like there are themes that are likely to do well. But when I'm really thinking about what's going to change IBM or Dell, it doesn't move the needle enough for the stock thing. If you want to get into cryptocurrencies, buy this thing called Cardano ADA. Blockchain is a very, very real thing. It is blockchain and cryptocurrencies is the beginning of what we would think of as the decentralization of power. Bitcoin is a bank without a bank. If I want to send you money, I need a bank to do it. Bitcoin allows me to send it from you to me, no bank, right? So blockchain would allow Uber without Uber. You could have a ride sharing thing without Uber. You could have iTunes without iTunes. So blockchain and cryptocurrencies is about the decentralization of power, and it's going to bring good and bad with it. And if you want to buy something that's really low right now, look up this thing called Cardano ADA. And then don't blame me if it goes bad.
We have a question about employment. As a middle-aged woman looking for a job, what industries are worth pursuing for the next 10 or 15 years?
Yeah, well, first, while I respond to it, type in maybe where you're coming from or what you think. I would love to hear your thoughts. But I think I would be in obviously an industry that's based off of, it's going to grow. Based locally, I think strength around the localization of economies, around people and services and experiences. So I feel like the big ones are going to be healthcare, education and enrichment. Wellness is within healthcare, but also separate. Craft products, objects. I mean, you could be knitting a hat and then you go on TikTok and Instagram and the next thing you know, you're paying 10 of your friends to knit the hats. Like when you think about your next job, it's not just the career of the sector, it's your ability, unless you're going to go work for a company, it's your ability to build a community around you or to join a community that is economically active, right? So I think there's lots of opportunity, but healthcare, education, and product, things, objects, high quality objects.
So Gary, I've been curious that people have often said, follow the baby boomers because they'll move through each stage of life and they'll blow the heck out of it. And
Yeah.
now as they're getting older, I wonder what will happen with the end of life experience, which I think we're terrible at. We do better with our animals in terms of kindness. And
Yep.
do you see any changes happening there?
Yep. And this may be something that I could follow up with, again, in the caregiver conversation for me, this is where it falls in. I really hope that this is not seen as like a disparaging kind of framing or label, but I have a friend that there is this concept of the death doula, right? That we are going to have people in our lives. There's end of life planning and the finance and all that stuff, but we are going to see, I think, massive growth in individuals that are just genuinely and naturally strong and empathetic and able to guide individuals through that process. It's a doula kind of model. So I think that end of life planning with the baby boomers only needs a nudge culturally, like mental health. End of life is like depression and anxiety in 1999, 2005. You don't talk about it, and we just need some celebrities, and we just need to socialize and normalize it. And then I think that whole field becomes very dynamic and mainstream. Huge opportunity.
Time for probably another one or two, maybe. So, does anyone else live here have a question? Susan.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about global warming, since that seems like
Yeah.
such an existential threat
Yeah.
that seems to hang over everything. And how can a futurist help with that, considering that we have so much resistance from business and government?
Yeah. So, and there's, Susan, but like, there's a lot I did not talk about. So climate
I know that's
change,
a big.
yeah, that's a big one, right? So climate change, I always try to piece it or break it down into, there is changes from climate policies. So take away the impact of climate change, there's change from the policies that are going to be enacted. And then there is potentially changes from climate system changes themselves. So, warmer oceans, stronger hurricanes, warmer oceans pulls the rain from the Midwest, and now we have a drought. You need to decarbonize the things in our world that are hard to decarbonize. It's very easy to decarbonize, to take out the energy, the carbon from the electrical grid. Wind, solar, hydro, nuclear, you can decarbonize the power industry. It's very hard to decarbonize transportation. It's very hard to decarbonize industry, steel making, cement making, food production. So what is happening is we're seeing the old incumbents, the oil and gas companies, moving into things like hydrogen, which allow industries that need high energy fuel. Like, you don't make steel out of electricity, right? You make it out of burning molecules. So the decarbonization of industry is our next stage. And that is now happening around hydrogen and this thing called power to gas. And it's very big now in Europe, right? And it's coming to the US in the years ahead. Right now, the US is solely focused on the electrical grid. And it's like, well, that's easy. That's already on its way. Now you got to decarbonize the trucking industry. You got to decarbonize cement manufacturing. So it's going to take big gas and big oil to take their power and influence to solve this problem. just demonizing this group is not going to get us anywhere. Solar does nothing to solve the bigger problems of climate change. So I think the solution is engaging the people that skirted the responsibility.
And
we all skirted.
Is there an indication that's happening?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's probably not going to happen fast enough for the people that are most involved in the climate change conversation, but it is absolutely happening. Clear targets have been set. China's behind it. So I'm very confident that we'll basically have a near decarbonized global economy by 2050. So
I'm excited.
yeah, be hopeful about that one.
Good.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we reached our 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
I think we probably, unless anyone has a burning final question, I think maybe, Sally, did you have one more thing you wanted to ask? You're muted.
Or
So
Heather.
unmute yourself. Oh, I'm sorry. Did Heather have one as well?
I do. Gary, are you an optimist about the future?
Oh, yeah, but it's like I also accept that bad things happen. I mean, you know, like the political the culture war. It's like it's not over if your party wins in November.
No.
It's not over. We
No.
got to grow up and start integrating this. You know, we got to grow up and not be like, oh, now we won, it's done. It's like, no, like this culture war is going to require us to not just be on the one side we're on, but to be able to integrate both sides. And if I'm optimistic, it's around leadership and people that can integrate these polarized worldviews. I mean, you know, like there's this phrase, small c conservatism, like family structure is good. You know, personal responsibility is good. Don't just sit there and blame everything on systemic this and that, historical this and that. Individuals need to take accountability for themselves. You try to say that to a woke liberal person, they're like, oh, it's historical, systematic. It's like, my goodness. Like we got to bring it together. So if I'm optimistic, it's only because we're able to overcome this culture war. And it's not going to be over because one side wins.
I'm just a quickie comment. I'm just so pleased that you spoke about the young electorate. I'd be thrilled to think that these people are actually going to vote. I think there's a big gap in, you know, people who are in their 20s who've just sat out everything.
Yep.
They're supposed to be the leaders of the future, but that will be not happening.
I'm hoping that they vote.
Yeah.
And, I mean, young people today are, I'm very optimistic about this Gen Z. You know, they are able to they're able to process, I think, complexity and nuance in ways that we didn't have to deal with at that stage of life. Identity, sexuality, gender, their ability to see a spectrum rather than this side, that side is greater. So
I'm happy to be a part of the Gen Z.
there we go.
I don't even know that people understand what the years are for Gen Z.
They are like the core right now is like 15, 20. So like the millennials, they're kind of cutting the millennials off now at like 96, 2000. I feel like the true Gen Z, because generations tend to have a front end and a back end. They're 20 years front end, back end. I think the core Gen Z right now is like 15 to 20.
It's a much smaller demographic than the other generations.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Gary, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
That was wonderful. It was a fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Everyone enjoyed it. Comments are great. And
Great.
I thank you for doing it. We really, really appreciate it. It was fascinating.
Thank you. I wish everyone the best. And I'm going to go ride to Coney Island. So
good for you.
my family and kids are away for a few more days. So I'm going to go live it up as a bachelor.
Fabulous.
All right. Great to meet everybody. I wish you all the best. And feel free to email me directly when it maybe pass along when I follow up. Happy to communicate one-on-one.
Thank you.